Hello, and welcome to American Amnesia. I am your host, Cliff Garner, and I'm going to switch gears a little bit. I caught a program in which Lee Stranahan was talking about a very interesting murder mystery that has kind of been hanging, it's been left hanging since the early 70s in which it occurred. And it was a big deal. We talk, you hear me talk about what I call the Great Sellout. The Great Sellout was an event that occurred, and it was one that took quite a while to work through. This is one of those events that played into the Great Sellout itself, and it accelerated the process of taking down the barricades, and it also accelerated the process in which many of the young radicals were scooped up by the Democratic Party, and they no longer supported a revolution anymore. At least the outward expressions of it. And also it began the process in which many of the more libertarian movements that were left in the cold with the movement of so many of the radicals into the from the counterculture into the Democratic Party, and that the other strains were a little bit more conservative in some respects, I suppose. I don't know that you really want to say they're conservative, though, but they weren't as traditionally left. As a matter of fact, the more traditionally leftist parts found a ready home in the Democratic Party. The Socialist Party had been an annex to the Democrats for quite some time by then. In fact, they were feeding into the Democratic Party, beginning probably more with Wilson, and then especially with FDR, that the socialists were sometime after FDR, I suppose. They weren't really looking for votes so much as to influence, and the Democrats were the party that they preferred to work with. And that's why Harrington, the socialist leader in the 50s and 60s and the early 70s, was so closely aligned with the Democrats, and especially with JFK, and had a lot to do with his reign. But the thing was that this Lee Stranahan, he's one of the names in the newer non-establishment news people, and he does a program. I forget the name. It pops up on Open Minds and a couple others that I watch it on. But he is trying to develop a new journalism, is what he's trying to do. And he's gone about it with kind of a multi-media approach, with not just the YouTube and that's what you have there, but he's also done movies and such, and he's planning to do a movie on this murder case. And let me just cut right to the quick on this. This was really, like I say, back in the day, it was a really big deal. But it was the murder of hang on a second. I want to make sure I get her name right. Betty Louise Van Patter, V-A-N, capital P-A-T-T-E-R. And Betty Van Patter was a friend of David Horowitz's. And so Betty Louise Van Patter, October 12th, 1929 to December 13th or January 17th, December 13th, 1974, or January 17th, 1975. They're not really sure when she died. But that's what they have on her gravestone. She was a bookkeeper who worked for the Black Panther Party. And Horowitz knew her, and he knew the Black Panthers. They're friends of his. And he set the two up because they needed a bookkeeper. She was found beaten and murdered. While no one ever was charged for the crime, many believe it was committed by members of the party. She had threatened to make her discovery public, that the party had doctored its book and had major tax problems. Now, this is from the Wikipedia.org entry for it. It's very short. But it has some really good sources, so that if you want to look up sources on this, I will include the ones I use in here, and a couple of them are in these, by the way. But it has others that you may want to avail yourself of to look into it even deeper. I find it a very interesting case. It was then, and I think it is still today. The information, and this is really just the bare bones of it. It says, after serving as a bookkeeper for Ramparts magazine, Van Patter became an aide to Black Panther leader Elaine Brown in 1974. And Elaine Brown is still around. She is I believe she's a judge now. She was for a while. But she's an American prison activist, writer, singer, former Black Panther Party chairwoman who was based in Oakland, California. She was also a Green Party presidential candidate in 2008. And I believe she was involved in some other political stuff. A member of the NAACP. In 2007, with the Greens, prison activist. At any rate, she's a fairly influential person in California politics, but she was a member of the Black Panther Party, and a rather prominent one at the time, in 1974. And that's after being introduced by David Horowitz. Van Patter went missing December 13th. Some weeks later, her severely beaten corpse was found on a San Francisco Bay beach. There was insufficient evidence for police to charge anyone with Van Patter's death, but the Black Panther Party was almost universally believed to be responsible. As journalist Frank Browning wrote in 1987, Christopher Hitchens, wrote in the Los Angeles Times that there is no doubt now that there was precious little then of the Panther leadership's complicity in this revolting crime. And she was more than just murdered. She was tortured. Raped and tortured and beaten to death. Very horrible death. FBI is investigating Van Patter, likely inquiring into her death, have been destroyed. There's a big cover-up of this. Well, it is true that I had come to dislike Betty Van Patter. I had fired her, not killed her, Brown wrote in 1993. Brown said Van Patter was fired because she was too nosy about the Black Panther Party and was of no benefit to the party. That's Elaine Brown's words. However, there are other stories that have come out since, including that Bobby Seale, one of the main leaders of the Black Panther Party, admitted that she was murdered. He confessed to it, and I believe he had something to do with it. Other leaders also did. However, you get people like Eldridge Cleaver's widow, who say that it's all COINTELPRO. Well, I understand Cleaver didn't say anything of the sort, that he was more agreeing with Bobby Seale. And this, like I say, this case had a lot to do with the rolling up of the barricades, and it ended, really ended a lot of the genius, I suppose, of the New Left and the counterculture and the various, I don't want to say entanglements, but more like alliances. And they were more than alliances at one point, but I don't think we can call them much more than that after everything decayed and blew away. Let me go to David Horowitz's article. This was written on Salon back in 1999. It would be December 13th, 1999. And again, David Horowitz's words. This is early years of the internet, and I do recall reading stuff like this back then. I don't recall if I read this particular article, but I'm sure I did. I'm a pretty big fan of Horowitz, and I'd like to get his opinion on a few of these things personally and bluntly. I did write him in regard to Great Sellout, but I haven't heard back from him. I'll write another. It was a snail mail letter that I sent, and I'll send another. 25 years ago Monday, my friend Betty Van Patter disappeared from a tavern on University Avenue called the Berkeley Square and was never seen alive again. 6 months earlier, I had recruited Betty to keep the books of the Educational Opportunities Corp, an entity I had created to run a school for the children of the Black Panther Party. By the time the police fished her battered body out of San Francisco Bay in January 1975, I knew that her killers were the Black Panthers themselves. Boom. And what had happened actually is that Ramparts had closed its doors, I think, in 1974. He set her up at the job with the Panthers. She died a year later in 1975. And at any rate, and that's actually January of that year, so it's not really even that much longer. And that there was a huge falling out because of this. A lot of the left crumbled because of this. And like I say, it did lead to the massive sellout that occurred during the Carter election in 1976. You see the time here. See how this interacts. There's other things that happened too, but this was a big deal, and it caused a huge schism between the Panthers and other groups within the New Left. And Horowitz himself had finished working at Ramparts, which was a great magazine, by the way, and he moved over into kind of a consumerism kind of a movement, definitely following after what's his name? He ran for president, for goodness sake. Anyway, but he got into consumerism. He actually showed you the products and had people test them out. It was pretty funny. It was a good show to watch. I loved it. And he actually became rather conservative rather quickly. And I think by 78, I believe he was a full-fledged Republican. So, at any rate, I believe it might have been a little later, but I think that was about right. I think it was about 78 that he had actually changed his mind on certain aspects of socialism, and especially revolution. But he knew that they were the Panthers who killed her. At the time, the Panthers were still being defended by writers like Murray Kempton and Gary Willis in the pages of the New York Times, and by then Governor Jerry Brown of California. He was dating, what's her name, the singer, Linda Ronstadt, doing a lot of coke with the Eagles and stuff. The governor was even a confidant of Elaine Brown, who had hired, who had hired Betty, and whom Huey Newton had appointed to stand for him as the Panther leader while he was in exile in Cuba. Yeah. And she was a big deal. At the time of Betty's death, Elaine was running for Oakland City Council and had just secured a $250,000 grant from the Nixon administration under a federal juvenile delinquency program. And remember, Nixon was the one that really kicked in with all this urban renewal, and Johnson did some, but Nixon really took it to heart, and it's almost a wonder that blacks didn't vote Republican more often. But it just goes to show you that this solidarity idea was taking root at the time, and the establishment had opened up its doors to some radical black folks, and that those that it was opening up, they were kind of being promised to become the new elite among the blacks, and that's exactly what happened. The sellout wasn't just white; it was multi-ethnic. J. Anthony Klein, the consigliere to whom she had been able to turn when the party's enforcers got in trouble with the law, was about to be appointed to Governor Brown's cabinet. Today, he's the judge. Today, Klein is a justice on the First Circuit Court of Appeals in San Francisco. Boom. You see what the deep state is. It's the original sellouts. Imagine that. In pursuit of answers to the mystery of Betty's death, I subsequently discovered that the Panthers had killed more than a dozen people in the course of conducting extortion, prostitution, and drug rackets in the Oakland ghetto, exploiting their own. Take note of that. Do not forget it. They built the money up by exploiting their own and letting them die. While these criminal activities were taking place, the group enjoyed the support of the American left, the Democratic Party, Bay Area trade unions, and even the Oakland business establishment. The head of Clorox, Oakland's largest company, for example, sat on a board of the Educational Opportunities Corp. Imagine that. And Jerry Rubin decried the fact that even at the height of the riots in the 60s, that there were big money people that were trying to get behind them. The great sellout was coming fast. In fact, it had already occurred probably by 68, and some of them were already in. On a far smaller scale, the Panther killings were an American version of the Katyn massacre, the infamous murder of Polish officers carried out on Stalin's orders that the left had denied and kept hidden for decades until the opening of the Soviet archives settled the dispute for good. And they did. It was much harder for me to understand why the Panthers should be able to get away with these murders in democratic America, and why the nation's press should turn such a blind eye to a group that the nation's law enforcement had made an object of its attentions. Why? The FBI was investigating them. The COINTELPRO was actually infiltrating them. They infiltrated them to a huge extent, to the point where actually there were probably just as many people from the CIA and FBI as there were people that were actually real radicals. See, this is what happens to all these radical movements, whether it's so-called left or so-called right. It's what happened to neo-Nazis. It's what happened to the Ku Klux Klan. And it's what happened to the Black Panther movement. And then they become part of the deep state. The unelected people that run the country. Imagine that. And that's who's fighting against Mr. Trump right now. Hello? But they betrayed their values a long time ago. This is 1974. January. Whatever the reasons, the fact remains that to this day, not a single organization of the mainstream press has ever investigated the Panther murders. There was more than just her. There was a lot of them. It was like heads were rolling all over the place. And really, the left was becoming afraid. It was like the Panthers were becoming the executioners for the government. Who are they going to take out next? And involving drugs, extortion, and prostitution, which means that they were moving people. You see a pattern yet? You see a pattern yet? You should. It's pretty obvious. No borders? Are you out of your mind? Let me back up. What are the reasons? The fact remains that to this day, not one organization of the mainstream press has ever investigated the Panther murders, even though the story is one that touches the lives and political careers of the entire liberal establishment, including the First Lady and Deputy Attorney General in charge of civil rights for the Clinton administration. Both Hillary Rodham Clinton and Bill and Lee began their political careers as law students at Yale by organizing demonstrations in 1970 to shut down the university and stop the trial of Panther leaders who had tortured and then executed a black youth named Alex Rackley. Another murder to actually cover crimes. This silence is even more puzzling since, despite the blackout by the national media, the details of the story have managed to trickle out over the years. And this trickle is, if you don't know what it's all about, then you might not even pay attention. But people like me, I do. I remember what it's about. I remember what was going on back then. And I remember, even as a young radical, that I had to try to overlook all this. Oh, yeah. I know what it's like to be an old radical, jump through all the hoops, and pronounce the shibboleth. You know, they don't do socialism right, right? No one has ever done socialism right, right? Yeah, I know how to do it. I know the routine. I know the steps too. I used to dance it. I won't do it anymore. I'll back up. This silence is even more puzzling since, despite the blackout by the national media, the details of the story have managed to trickle out over the years. This has been the result of efforts by me and my colleague Peter Collier, by radical journalist Kate Coleman, by Huey P, by the Nonprofit Center for Investigative Reporting, New Times Magazine, or one or two others, including the most particularly David Talbot and David Weir, now editors at Salon. I don't think they're there anymore, by the way. I'd have to look. Because of our efforts, informed citizens are at least aware of these murders. On the other hand, unlike in the Soviet Union, where testimonies emerged as soon as the threat of retaliation was gone, in the 25 years since Betty's death, few additional witnesses have come forward to add to our knowledge about her case or these or other American crimes. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of veterans of the 60s who have at least some knowledge of these deeds, but have remained silent and therefore complicit to this day. Of course, you have to ask which of them are still alive. The salient question, and in the black community, you almost wonder why murder is one of the main leading causes of the death of young black men. How so with old black men? Think about it. These include notable figures like Tom Hayden, who's now dead, and journalists like Los Angeles Times columnist Robert Scheer, both of whom promoted the Panthers as revolutionary heroes at the time, and have failed to correct that impression ever since. Now, let me just very quickly. Tom Hayden was one of the leaders of SDS. He married Jane Fonda, and he ran for various offices in California. He was a typical California pseudo-liberal. Very typical stuff. Instead of going underground with the Weather Underground, he ended up going to California and just becoming a liberal. Oily character. But it also includes many lesser figures who work day in, day out to facilitate the Panthers' rise to power and cover up their crimes along the way. Evidently, these fellow travelers have remained convinced that even though their crimes were committed, it was and is no responsibility of theirs to help solve them. I'm constantly asked by people who have read my autobiography, Radical Son, who have heard me talk about these events, how it is that my former comrades on the left can remain so silently and so stubbornly devoted to experiments like the Panthers that failed, to the doctrines that are false, and to causes that are demonstrably wrong-headed and even evil. On November 20th, an answer to these questions came in the form of a letter from an old friend, a Berkeley writer named Art Goldberg, who was himself deeply involved in the activities of the Panthers and in their deceptions, and who remains a faithful keeper of the progressive flame today. He's not black. You can tell his name's Jewish. Goldberg and I grew up in Long Island, and so is what's his name? Horowitz. He is also Jewish. He was probably also a red diaper baby. Goldberg and I grew up in Long Island on the same block in Sunnyside, New York, a neighborhood in Queens that had been colonized by the Communist Party, to which both our parents belonged. Yeah, I knew that. The red diaper babies. Because Art was a few years older, he and I weren't that close as children, but we became friends after college when we found ourselves together in Berkeley in 1960s, members of the nascent New Left. Art was a writer for the Berkeley Blarb and other movement papers. He made himself particularly useful to the Black Panther Party. So valuable was Art's propaganda to the Panthers that eventually Huey Newton assigned him to write the official biography of Charles Gary, the lawyer who defended Newton against charges that he had murdered a young policeman named John Fry, or Frey, one of the two. Newton had indeed committed the murder, but in Art's account and in all writings of the new leftists at the time, not now, but at the time, Huey was presented as an innocent victim of a racist conspiracy by the state. Sound familiar? Black Lives Matter. Hands up, don't shoot. Art and another friend named Marty Kenner were the new leftists closest to the Panthers among everyone I knew. Marty was a stockholder, put money in it, who had organized the famous Leonard Bernstein party that Tom Wolfe satirized in Radical Chic, and was working virtually full-time as Huey Newton's personal emissary and financial guru. Well, those folks ended up rich. I don't think you realize it, but they did. Rich. Not just well-off, rich. Filthy, bloody rich. In the 1960s, not unusual. In the 1960s, I kept my distance from the party because I had been frightened by their gun-toting style and hectoring posture. As the 70s began, however, Newton announced that it was time to put away the gun, and I became involved with the school project I had already mentioned. At first, I had intended to just raise the money for the school, but when Kenner withdrew unexpectedly, he told me he was burned out. That's a quote. I was left with the task of organizing the school myself. It was as a result of this responsibility that I recruited Betty Van Patter to keep its books. He trusted her. He worked with her before. I had not seen or heard from Goldberg or Kenner for 15 years when I received Art's letter, which was in response to my recent book, Hating Whitey and Other Progressive Causes, one of whose chapters is a memoir of Betty's death. And see, things haven't changed since back then. It's like it was all kind of frozen in place. That's how stagnant it is. You see why Abby Hoffman committed suicide when he did? He was in despair. November 19th, 1999. Dear David, every so often I hear about something you've written that pisses somebody off, but I don't much care because I've pretty much retired from politics. One thing I have been meaning to tell you for years, however, concerns the death of Betty Van Patter, the Ramparts bookkeeper. In my mind, you are the person responsible for her death. Sending her in to audit the Panthers' books at that particular time was tantamount to dressing her in a Ku Klux Klan white sheet and sending her up to 125th Street in Harlem or West Oakland. I distinctly remember warning you to be careful about getting too involved with the Panthers because things were getting pretty crazy at the time you jumped in. Remember, this guy's even more radical than Horowitz was at a time when Horowitz was extremely radical. And he warned him. I think Horowitz believed Bobby Seale, and he said he was trying to get away from the gun. I understand he was quite a likable fellow, some Bobby Seale. Easy to relate to. I distinctly remember warning you to be careful about getting too involved with the Panthers because things were getting pretty crazy at the time you jumped in. I had pulled back. Marty Kenner had pulled back, and so had Stu Albert. Had you asked Stu or myself, we would have urged you not to send Betty into the school under the circumstances in which you did. The fact that you let Betty deal with them directly was incredibly naive on your part and shows you had no idea what was going on with the Panthers at that time. That's probably true. If you had asked Stu, myself, or Marty, we could have told you. Kenner, after all, knew a lot about the Panthers' finances, as he was a major fundraiser. Nothing happened to him. Wonder what he knows. Or knew. He's probably dead by now. The problem was that you were inexperienced and naive, and Betty Van Patter got killed because of it. That's why whenever anyone brings up Betty's death after you've written about it or alluded to it, I always say it was really Horowitz's fault. He set her up. As I said, it was like putting her in a white sheet and sending her up to Harlem. Just wanted to let you know what I've been thinking. Peace, Art. What are friends for? Here's the answer I sent back. December 12th, 1999. Dear Art, unlike you, I don't pretend to have retired from politics, and unlike you, I try not to lie to myself. Having become a conservative, I am prepared for how pathetic, vicious, and disloyal some human beings can be. Well, and how sublimely unaware of the disgusting image they present to others, even as they preen their moral selves for their own approval. As a result, your letter doesn't really surprise me. The fact that you should have spent 10 seconds carrying around your insipid thoughts about Betty's death is laughable. Nevertheless, I thank you for revealing how ignorant you are about yourself and your friends, and how you are still wallowing in the evil you once engulfed us all in. Marty Kenner, my possible savior. If I had only thought of that. It was Marty, of course, who left the Panther school project in my hands, and without bothering to say why. Boy, I'd really be pretty bent about that, actually. The same Marty who was so far from thinking the thugs that he was among were bad guys that 10 years later he attended the great Huey P. Newton's funeral as a fan. And then played the role of behind-the-scenes sponsor of Panther Field Marshal David Hilliard's self-glorifying book just before he became president crackhead of the Dr. Huey P. Newton Foundation and resident tour guide of historic Panther sites. Stupid me. Why didn't I think of asking Marty for help? Nothing happened to Marty, as you put it. Nobody raped and tortured him and then bashed his head, as I would phrase the same. Because his nose is so far up Huey's ass right up to the end that he couldn't get his tongue loose to annoy them, even if he thought of doing so. Give this, at least, to Betty. She wasn't killed because she was white or stupid. She was killed because she had the integrity and the grit to talk back. That's probably what got her killed. She wasn't spineless the way you and your friends are. She was killed because she wasn't a feckless servant of rapists and murderers like you and Marty were then and apparently still are now. And Stu Albert. How could I have overlooked good old Stu when I was in need of advice? Stu Albert, the yippie genius who wrote a letter to the Ramparts calling me a police agent because in an editorial I had condemned the SLA's assassination of a black father of 3 children whose only crime was to have been a superintendent of schools. Good old SLA. My editorial gave a green light to law enforcement to carry out the richly deserved execution of Stu's beloved SLA fruitcakes. With stand-up talent like this, Art, you really should go on Leno. I see you are still crusading for social justice, and we've always called it that. These SJWs, they've latched onto the PC for years. No changes. They just get stupider every year. More vapid. I see you're still crusading for social justice, going around telling anyone who has read my latest feeble attempt to write this historical record and show the world what we did. It was really Horowitz's fault. He set her up. Don't worry, my friend. I'm not going to return the favor and say you did it and I didn't. Of course, you did write all those rave notices and cover-ups encouraging others to help feed the Panthers' criminal appetites, or has age affected your memory of this? But I'm still not going to tell people it was your fault, that I somehow got involved with the Panthers recruited Betty, or that even that you kept your mouth shut all the time I was down in Oakland putting my life and hers in danger. Of course, you've already prepared your alibi. You told me, quote, things were getting pretty crazy at the time, unquote. What was I supposed to make of that? Crazy could mean that the police were after them, that some of them were agents, or that these pressures were creating internal conflicts that I had to look out for. In all caps. Did you tell me that Huey Lewis was a fucking murderer and might kill me? We return to regular writing. Of course you didn't. In fact, everything you had written or said to me about Huey Newton told me exactly the opposite. And that is all you've ever written to anyone or said about me, said to me about Huey and his progressive gang to this day. But I still won't point my finger at you now or blame you for what you did then, or what I did then. I'm sorry. I won't do that because that's how I felt in this mess, or fell into this mess in the first place. By blaming others for what I did or did not do, by blaming them for my own malaise. And that's what your self-serving politics is finally about, Art. Yours and Marty's and Stu's. It's about putting responsibility where it doesn't belong. It's about blaming everyone but yourselves. It's about getting others to blame anybody besides themselves for who and what they are. I'm glad you wrote this letter. It makes all the pain and all the wounds inflicted on me by you and your comrades since then seem worth it. Because it shows what wretched human beings I was involved with when I was one of you. When I was a member of the Progressive Vanguard and at war with the so-called enemies of the people. Your letter shows me that in all these years you haven't changed a bit, but I have. And it's the only thing in this whole mess that I'm not sorry about. Signed, David. It's amazing when you think about it. There were so many things that we had to turn our heads and ignore. And I did until I shuffled it off little by little. I don't think that I don't think that I could ever explain all the feelings I have about all this kind of stuff. And there's always a part of me that youthful idealism, you come back to it and you say, well, there are things. And separating those from what was not right. That's not an easy thing to do. And you almost wonder how much of the baby in the bathwater, goes together here. You have to question yourself sometimes on that. But ultimately, you get past that the one single truly pragmatic part of what the SJWs and the old radicals from back in the day were all trying to get. It was all power for their pragmatic issues. They didn't care what kind of fictions they spouted. They were only concerned about obtaining power. And that's still the issue. That's why they must be stripped of it. That's why they must be stripped of it. Because there's nothing in them that prepares them to treat power well. And they don't. And I look at the young people who accept those ideas, and a lot of them will grow out of them, and a lot of them will even take those ideas and develop them into more of a real world thing. But so many of them will just hang on to the fiction with the power and put the fig leaf in front of it and tell the young people to get in front first in line so they can be mowed down first and also become the martyrs. It's pathetic jerks that would keep eating their own. They should never be allowed power. And I'm talking about the Hillary Clintons. I am talking about the Tom Haydens that tried over the years. Those people should never, ever be given power. Because we see what they do with what they get. And it's not good. And they're utterly irresponsible, always blame everybody else, and they can never accept responsibility. It's not in them. I'm going to read an article from Front Page Magazine. This was dated April 23rd, 2002. And I was still in the States when all this happened. And I remember reading something along those lines anyway. Panther leader Seale confesses. The radio show on which Bobby Seale and I appeared, and in which he refers to his partial confession, was hosted by Pat Buchanan and Al Fromm. Far from the busting my butt, Seale conceded both on air and off that what I was saying about Panther criminality was right. But he contended that it was all Eldridge Cleaver's fault. Oh yeah, he's safely dead. And or that he, Seale, knew nothing about it at the time. Huey Newton, right? Seale's contract when Newton, Elaine Brown, and other Panthers murdered Betty Van Patter. He was no longer a member of the party. He had been beaten up, sodomized by Newton, and disappeared for more than a year because he was afraid for his own life. See how they treat their own? Bobby Seale was one of the main guys. Huey Newton sodomized him. Just amazing. Just amazing. Beat him up, sodomized him. And then he ran away in fear of his own life. Well, you can understand that. On the other hand, while Bobby Seale was in jail in 1969 and 70, awaiting trial for his role in the torture murder of Panther Alex Rackley, a party member named Fred Bennett had an affair with Seale's wife and got her pregnant. Fred Bennett was subsequently murdered. Like more than a dozen other murders committed by the Black Panther Party in its heyday, Fred Bennett's murder remains unsolved. Yeah, there's a whole slew of them. I mean, and you know, the new Panther Party, you know, they're just as bad, but well, I shouldn't say they're just as bad, but they aren't quite as murderous. I don't think they've been allowed to get away with it, actually, but they've been bad in other ways. Really disgusting. It's a disgusting history. These guys are a little worse than street thugs. They all ruckins up in Chicago were really no worse. I met them. They hadn't been all removed by the time I got up there in 1980. There were some weird MOs. Oh yeah. Creepy. Really creepy dudes. On the other hand, while Bobby Seale was in jail in 1969 and 70 awaiting trial for his role in the torture murder of Alex Rackley, party member named Frank Bennett had an affair with Seale's wife and got her pregnant. Fred Bennett was subsequently murdered. Like more than a dozen murders committed by the Black Panther in its heyday, Fred Bennett's murder remains unsolved. I'm sorry to see that Seale is still blaming law enforcement, COINTELPRO, for his crimes. See, this becomes a universal whipping boy for some of these people, you know, that are leftovers, I suppose you'd call them. They need a whipping boy because otherwise they have to face the fact of their own crimes. I'm happy, on the other hand, to see that he has seen fit to admit the part of the truth. I look forward to the day when he is ready to tell the whole truth and nothing but. David Horowitz. And that's, I'm going to take Horowitz's intro to this. This is by Dan Flynn, actually. COINTELPRO is still here, Bobby Seale told an audience at last week's Black Panther reunion. They still tap my phone to this day. Clearly, Seale still retains some of the paranoia of his Panther days. Much of the ideological baggage of the 60s, however, he's left behind. Seale, to the shock of some in the audience, and he's dead now, by the way, Bobby Seale. In fact, most of them are. They didn't have good lifespans. Clearly, Seale retains some of the paranoia of his Panther days, but much of the baggage of the 60s, however, he is left behind. Seale, to the shock of some in the audience, declared, "Race is bullshit." He ridiculed Nation of Islam theories to maintain that an evil scientist created whites in a laboratory after the Human Genome Project was complete. Seale remarked that he realized that humans are actually more than 99% alike. Well, you know, that's the thing I keep saying. The whole racist idea is based on such garbage. There's facts and there's fictions. And we know more of the fictions because that's what's coming off of people's lips. The idiots. And they don't know what they're talking about, but they keep talking. Seale labeled the preoccupation with Marxism by many radicals as an exercise in intellectual masturbation. I'll go with that. The revolution he now seeks, he proclaimed, has nothing to do with violence. He's abandoned the Panthers' past enthusiasm for guns as well. I don't think you need guns, he remarked. I don't see the relevance of guns. The University of District of Columbia audience witnessed Seale honestly address some of the law-breaking committed by his fellow party members. Seale declared, "I love Huey, but Huey used to do some crazy stuff." Seale recounted how Newton used to lurk for prey outside the emergency room of Oakland Hospital. When patients were rushed into the emergency room for cars, Newton would steal from the abandoned vehicles. At another session, Seale candidly discussed the botched robbery of a gas station by a Panther. Despite his willingness to reevaluate past Panther dogma and frankly confront misdeeds by individual Panthers, there are some aspects of the Black Panther Party that Seale clearly did not want to revisit. David Horowitz wants to paint all the Black Panther Party, as he puts it, as Black Panther murderers. Seale responded to this writer's query about Panther crimes committed, alleged by Horowitz. He can't do it. He's angry. The specific allegations made by David Horowitz and relayed to Seale last weekend involved Black Panther leaders embezzling funds and murdering a potential whistleblower, Betty Van Patter. Seale didn't deny the allegations. In fact, everything that he said, other than obligatory condemnations of Horowitz as a liar, supported Horowitz's charge. Supposedly, Huey Newton or Elaine Brown or somebody had taken $100,000, and Huey Newton did serve 6 months in jail for personal use of $100,000. Seale admitted, adding, "Remember, this was all after I left the party." Yeah, you can understand why he left. Yeah, Bobby Seale was the Black Panther member that was actually part of the Chicago 8. And then after he was dropped from the group and tried separately, they were called the Chicago 7. There was a very strong Chicago chapter of the Black Panthers, and one of their leaders was murdered, and I think it was the early 70s. But anyway, that's kind of besides the point. Interesting sidebar, I suppose. Van Patter, who served the party in an accounting capacity, covered severe financial improprieties by the Panthers. On December 13, 1974, Van Patter disappeared. Her dead body, head caved in, would later turn up in the San Francisco Bay. Seale allows that things were getting out of... By the way, bodies don't last too well in San Francisco Bay. They have sharks. Seale allows that things were getting out of hand in the party by the mid-70s. "I wanted to stop the Black Panther Party," the graying radical confessed. "I had stumbled on Huey Newton abusing cocaine at the time viciously. I stumbled on him trying to take over the drug trade operations in Oakland, California." I think that's how he died. Seale admitted that Newton attempted to shake down pimps and drug dealers, and as a result, the ne'er-do-well population of Oakland took out a contract on Newton's life. "I was very, very pissed," Seale maintains. "If I had stayed around, I would have probably killed Huey myself." Well, yeah, he raped him. Raped and beat him. I mean, that's pretty bad stuff. Of course, he had help. Took a little help to do that. It wasn't like Bobby Seale was an easy guy to beat up. Not to mention sodomize. Good grief. This is kind of like right out of Pulp Fiction. You know, I mean, this is some sick stuff. Later, Seale offered a tacit acknowledgement that the Panthers probably did kill Van Patter. "David Horowitz," he remarked, "is probably still feeling guilty because he left Betty Van Patter there. If the Panthers didn't kill Van Patter, what would Horowitz have to feel guilty about?" That's a good question. Despite offering no dispute to the substance of Horowitz's specific charge, Seale still felt compelled to deny that his old ideological comrade was right. "I got David Horowitz on a live radio show and bawled his butt out about every lie he told in his books." Oh yeah, I'd like to hear that. "Now, David Horowitz cannot write us out of history like that," Seale proclaimed. "He can try all he wants. The Panthers, as Seale correctly recognizes, cannot be erased from our cultural memory. Yet it's not David Horowitz, but the unflattering truth that secures the Black Panthers' place in the infamy of the annals of history." And Daniel J. Flynn is the author of Why the Left Hates America, exposing the lies that have obscured our nation's greatness. Yeah, we need to no longer look at that and realize those lies are lies. There's been a lot of them. This case was a very important one, and it was a big one, and there were others too. And the Black Panthers, you know, if you just read what little is even said about them, you know, you almost wonder why they had any purpose other than they were a black group. You know, you probably get more from watching Forrest Gump or something. one of the few movies to even deal with the subject. And it didn't even do a very good job of it there. So, you know, it's one of those things. They've been trying to cover this stuff up for way too long, and the holes are bigger than the story. And it's because they're trying to hide all this. And these people, a lot of them are still alive. A lot of them are dead. They're just starting to die off. The old 60s radicals are you know, older than I am. We can't let them get away with it. And as much as possible, we should make them see, if maybe not prison sentences, at least be publicly denounced as liars, deceivers, murderers, really just idiots, just plain idiots. Some of the stupid things they have done. And they're continuing to do today, and they will not let up even now. The Great Sellout. Why did it happen? There are a lot of reasons why it happened, but this feeds into it. The end of Vietnam that came with Gerald Ford, fall of Saigon, which happened in '75, the rise of Carter. All these things. You just look at a timeline, and it's boom, 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 boom. Just right in order, one after the other. That's why it happened. So, until next time.